Good morning. I'm Britton Heller. I'm an affiliate with the Stanford's Cyber Policy Center. My work centers on the intersection between VR, human rights, and law, and I am so pleased to see you all here today in person and to all of you attending virtually on Zoom. Some of us have just gone to the Stanford Virtual Human Interaction Lab and experienced firsthand some of this frontier edge technology, AR, VR, haptics, even smell-o-vision. And today we're going to talk about all of the gaps that emerge when you look at existing law and these new technologies. And we're going to talk about not the general issues that normally arise at VR conferences, but we're going to go deeper and we're going to talk about how these gaps emerge, why these gaps emerge, and what we can do about it. Thank you to Nate Persily and to Ben Rosenthal. Thank you to Michelle Puan out there and to the, Jeremy Bailenson, Brian Beams, and the entire staff of the Stanford Virtual Human Interaction Lab. We're going to get started because we have a very full agenda today. And I'd like to introduce Professor Jeremy Bailenson. He's been working in AR/VR for about 25 years now, is the founding director of the Virtual Human Interaction Lab. And I'm going to leave it at that, because otherwise we could just go on for a very long time talking about all of his research and accolades. So please join me in welcoming Jeremy.
Hello, everyone. So great to see you here. Thank you for being here. Thanks for those who came to the lab this morning and was very brave and did all sorts of wonderful demos. And thank you for embracing the flipped classroom. So for those of you who did your homework and did that video, saw the video, as you know, our goal here today is to really go deep and to learn a ton about VR and AR. So what I thought I'd do, instead of blathering at you, would be to send you a video in which my recording blathers at you, and then to offer hands-on demos to a bunch of you, which a number of you took me up on. And we're going to run this as a pure Q&A. So during COVID, we shifted all of our teaching to what's called a flipped classroom, which is that students prepare reading any information or watching any information that's available online in advance, and when we come together, we just talk. So, questions?
Can you talk a little bit about surprises in the last, I don't know how many years, on the trajectory of VR that you didn't predict, 15 years earlier, to get a sense of what part of this is to see where we are on the trajectory going forward and what surprises we might expect ahead, but also sort of, you've been doing this a lot, and so to take advantage of your presence here.
So thank you, Nate. My evil plan here is to give very long-winded questions, so it's pretty much like a talk. And so on that question, where do I think we are as a field and how do we get here? Sorry for wandering, camera people. I tend to do that, but I'll stick up front. So I've been studying VR since the late 1990s. I got my PhD in cognitive science at Northwestern University. My PhD was on building mathematical models of how the brain works, running experiments on things like categorization, decision-making, building low-level AI models to model that. In 1999, I switched fields, and I went to UC Santa Barbara, got a postdoc where I learned how to build the hardware to make VR. Back then, you had to get on ladders and solder cameras and do all that fun stuff, to how to program the content. And I moved on from questions about how the brain functions to larger questions about social interaction, communication, entertainment. And so I was at UCSB till 2003. I got to Stanford in 2003, where I'm now in the Department of Communication, where if you believe a communications department should study media, what I do is I study the medium of virtual reality. And so Stanford took a chance on this very weird dude in 2003 as a VR guy, and I've been here for 20 years. Nate, when we talk about kind of the big events in VR's history, I like to start with the thing that blew my mind was the Microsoft Kinect. Microsoft worked with an Israeli company that figured out how to track all of your body movements without having to stick anything on your body. This notion of being able to track your body is essential to VR. So for how many of you guys have spent more than 10 hours in VR? Hands in the air, just so I get a sense of the audience. How many haven't? Okay. So the way VR works, it's a cycle of three things: tracking, rendering, and display. Okay, so if I'm walking towards you, you guys get bigger. Okay, well, the real world works really easily. In VR, if I'm going to draw you as bigger, okay. Sure. In VR, if I'm going to draw you as bigger, I have to know that I've leaned forward. And so in order to make VR work, tracking, your body's got to be tracked constantly. And one of the biggest problems in VR's history has been that you've had to wear clunky things, you've had to have rooms that have no light to make it work. And so when we talk about blowing my mind in the history of VR, the Microsoft Kinect or PrimeSense, the company from Tel Aviv that created the technology, that's where it begins. When you think about what happened today with standalone VR, which is VR that doesn't require a personal computer, but now runs on just the VR headset itself. So the people who are just in my lab use the MetaQuest 2. Stanford bought us 200 MetaQuest 2s, and that amazing device does tracking, rendering, and display all in the same thing. There's cameras that track your movements. There's a little computer there that redraws the scene every time you move. If you put your hand up, it draws your hand up because it knows that you've moved your hand, and then it displays that in stereo to each eye. And so tracking, rendering, and display all occurs on the same standalone headset. So what surprised me in a 5-year-long history is that standalone VR is so good. It just works all the time. And you don't need a dedicated personal computer with a good video card, and you don't need to put duct tape on the windows to make sure that light doesn't appear in the room. A consequence of this is that standalone VR has destroyed the market for great VR. Okay? So if you're rendering on a headset, you don't have a lot of time to generate lots of polygons and beautiful textures and lighting because the computer is tiny, as opposed to a PC with a cord to your headset. So one of the challenges of standalone VR is that standalone VR has cornered about 80% of the market share, and that's probably conservative. So anyone who makes a living of developing great VR, we no longer have a market because it has to work on a headset with a tiny computer that has to update 90 times a second. So one of the surprises in my mind as a VR person is how quickly standalone VR has destroyed the market for great VR. So now that's just a question of Moore's Law, and that'll be solved. But Nate, you're asking from a policy standpoint or just kind of big picture about the field?
Useful, but also whether it's harms that you didn't expect that are now emerging, whether it's the relevant players in the field and what they've done. I mean, the standalone VR point is, I think, kind of what I was driving at, but other sort of aspects. I mean, since, I remember, I'll just tell folks here, when I was recruited here to Stanford, I came since one of my appointments is in communication, I came to Jeremy's lab and he said, just put this thing on, right? And I remember this in that first, whatever was 15 years ago. And we're in a very different place right now, and I'm sort of just wondering what surprises either sociologically or in the market that you saw. Yeah.
So when we talk about the downsides of VR, I talk about 5 or 6 of them, okay? The downside of VR that keeps me up at night the most is distraction. So when you're wearing VR, you can't see the real world. You can't hear the real world. And so you're going to walk into cactuses, you're going to smash into walls, you're going to step on the cats. As far as I know, there's only been 1 death in VR in Moscow in 2017. A man was gaming, fell through a plate glass window table and bled to death. As far as I know, that's the only instance of that happening. But if you want to go to any social media and search for a hashtag VR fail, you'll see lots of instances of people getting hurt. What keeps me up at night truly, one of my, at Stanford, we're allowed to do work with industry, and it's one of the fun parts of being at Stanford. For 5 years, I worked, my direct report was the president of Samsung Electronics, Young Sohn, and I used to do an exercise with the C-suite of Samsung. I would say, if you could go back in time and you could make this device not work in a moving car, if you went into a car, an accelerometer determined you were moving and power went off, would you do that? And so on the con side, we no longer get to talk on the phone in the car. On the pro side, conservatively, you're saving 10 lives a day because of people who are texting while driving. Okay, so I got to work with Samsung while they were developing their AR strategy, and one of my never shut up about points was I don't want VR to work in a moving car. You may in this audience, you may say nobody would drive while using VR, but we have data points on this. We have data points on this. There's a little game called Pokemon Go. And in Pokemon Go, you look through the camera and you drive, or you walk around trying to find Pokemon. There's many examples of people getting into car accidents because they're playing Pokemon Go. On the other side of it, you actually have VR companies who are developing products to make VR work in cars. And so one of the ways, I'm almost always a nice person to all people, one of the ways that I get a little bit prickly is on people who are trying to make VR work really well in cars, because they say, no, it's for the passengers, or it's for driverless cars. And I say, no. Let them read a book. Let them do something else. As a field, if there's one thing you learn from this Q&A, everyone in this room should lobby against VR working in a car. You can save lives tomorrow. I mean, that's the best way to... So distraction is number one of my downsides. Second downside is addiction. There's no research on addiction because I don't know any professor who's going to force people to use VR for 40 hours a week and then have a control condition who's not. There's a fairly growing literature on addiction in video game research, and we're starting to learn more about that. But when you always look perfect and you're always at a party and everyone's looking at you and you get to do anything you want in headset, do people go out into the real world? That's a really important point to think about. The third worst day of my professional life was when I published an op-ed about behavioral modeling. So I am proudly have worked for 20 years with the US military, and I'm quite sure that VR makes soldiers better at their job. It makes pilots better flyers. It makes teams better at positioning themselves. It makes people better able to learn how to use weapons. VR is here because the US military funded research through the 70s, 80s, and 90s. What worries me on this third point of a downside is something called behavioral modeling, which is that we know that VR is a home run for training, right? It's that the original use case of VR, and pretty much every use case that I talk about in my talk is some form of training. If somebody wants to do violence, I can go to the store. I'm positing out a year or two now. And because AAA games and video games are intensely realistic, graphics-wise, and they have great military folks consulting on the narrative and the action in the games, what's going to happen in VR quite soon is you're going to be able to have a simulation that if I want to do violence, but I'm not very good at it, I'm going to learn how to do it very quickly. And so the third worst work day of my life was when I published an op-ed on how video game VR designers should embrace 3 design principles. So the first paragraph of the op-ed was, VR is free speech. Be as violent as you want, and our country protects that. And I had a couple paragraphs on that really clearly. But then I said, wouldn't it be great if our VR designers did 3 things to keep people alive later on? Number 1, when you shot a VR gun, bullets worked with gravity. So if I wanted to shoot Lewis, I'd have to shoot up this way. And whatever skills I learned in VR wouldn't generalize to how to aim a gun in the real world. Number 2, the things that I was brutally killing in VR, which again is free speech and should exist, they're not shaped like humans, they're not sized like humans, and when they move, they have a non-human type gait, so I don't learn how to lead them and hit them. Number 3 is the input devices to when you do violence shouldn't be shaped like a gun. It shouldn't have a trigger like a gun. It shouldn't be weighted like a gun. In other words, I shouldn't be able to use this VR device in order to gain skills on how to use this weapon, unless you're a soldier or a police officer or somebody whose job it is to do that. And what happened, I made the mistake of publishing this on CNN.com, and they published the op-ed, and for some reason, so my wife's a journalist, and I spent an extra day carefully negotiating the headline, because for those that haven't written, you write your article, but then the editor chooses the headline. And so I carefully chose the headline not to be hyperbolic, because I really don't want to regulate free speech. And so they actually used my headline, but for some insane reason, they paired my article with a huge picture of Donald Trump. That was the image for my article. And then the Gamergate community got activated. Who's heard of the Gamergate community? For some reason, the Gamergate, it's a lobby group where they want to protect video game as an economic market, and they come after people. And I had death threats. I had to call the police a number of times. Somebody morphed a picture, a video of my face with Adolf Hitler on YouTube. It was a really bad day. So, but I still think behavioral modeling is something, and if VR is about body tracking, you learn the skills to do stuff. The fourth downside of VR is overuse. So in my lab today, we had 15 people spend about 30 minutes in VR, and we stopped it because we didn't want anyone to get dizzy, we didn't want anyone to get nauseous, we didn't want people to have any reality blurring, forgetting where they were. But in general, we worry about people spending too much in VR simply for health reasons. I'm talking a lot about the downsides here, so maybe I'll pause on that. But I think a lot about these, and we can talk also about what's being done to address them. The answer is very little. The last thing I'm going to say is privacy is one of these, but I'm not going to talk about privacy because a lot of you are going to talk about it today. Mark Miller is going to give a talk about our lab's work. Yes, Mark.
I want to ask a flip side of Nate's question.
Yeah.
I want to ask the flip side of Nate's question. What were you sure 20 years ago when you came here that we were going to have by now that we either don't have or are never going to get?
Yeah, thank you for that. So in terms of when you're going to put a headset on, it actually flows really nicely from those two questions. So VR is hard. You can't see the real world. It puts these marks on your face. You start sweating. You can only use it for half an hour. VR is not for everything. And so early on, the philosophy of our lab is use VR, but barely at all. So VR is a tool for special experiences. We've coined an acronym called DICE. Save VR for things that if you did them in the real world would be dangerous, impossible, counterproductive, or expensive. And I'll give you some examples. Dangerous, training firefighters. You don't want someone to burn, so you practice in VR. Impossible, for those who were in my lab and just did a simulation where you changed gender, or changed skin color, or changed age, and experienced walking around in someone else's shoes for a moment in VR. That's impossible to do in the real world. Counterproductive. We teach about deforestation. If you use non-recycled paper, we force you to cut down trees in VR. That changes your paper use in the real world. If I were to teach you about deforestation by forcing you to cut down those trees over there, that'd be a counterproductive way to do it. And then expensive. So when we work with the Stanford football team and we train the third string quarterback, it'd be expensive to have all 11 players on the defense and the other 10 offensive players be on the field just for that third stringer to practice. VR solves that problem. So Mark, to where I'm not surprised is that the field, and I've talked to just about everybody that you can think of who's in the position to make companies to do this, I've always said, do not do knowledge work in VR. VR is not for reading your email, right? And if there's a way where the market is basically supported the way that I've been blathering for 25 years, is that VR is great for these intense, full body, immersive, arousing experiences. This works fine for your email. You don't need to stick on a headset. So my DICE acronym seems to have stood the test of time, which is that VR is really great for certain things, special experiences. The other philosophy we have as a lab is if a medium isn't broken, don't fix it. Do you know what's not broken? Video games. They work really well. We don't need VR for them. It's arguably the best thing the US makes is video games. Do you think we need to stick it in a headset? No, it's not a broken problem. Whereas, for the Walmart employees, we trained 1 million Walmart employees last year in headset because their training is terrible. No offense to Walmart, I don't want to take that back. In general, corporate training, you learn about, I'll give an example here, and it's a hard example to talk about, but I'll talk about it because it fits both these issues. One of the hardest things I've ever done in VR, and one of the most rewarding things that I've done, is an active shooter trainer. So we've built these for Verizon, and we've built these for Walmart and a number of other companies. The Walmart demo, you put on the headset, and a gunman comes in and starts shooting the place up, and you're in the scene, and there's a gunman, sticks a gun in your face. And then the simulation pauses, and you've got to figure out, what do I do next? And you figure something out, and then you get some feedback, and it's a 25-minute simulation where everything from do you look the shooter in the eye, to how do you tell your colleagues to scatter to not get in trouble, to when you go to the safe, how do you position your body, all of these designed by safety experts that you now is all in VR. So you take this headset off, and the first thing you say is, boy, I really didn't enjoy that. That was not, so I don't want to do that often. On the other hand, you say, can you believe the people before me, they were doing that on PowerPoint? They learned how to do that. And in 2019, when the shooter came into the Walmart in El Paso, we actually had a number of associates on the floor who had done our VR training, and the CEO of Walmart is quick to say in interviews that lives were saved because the associates made more accurate and, more importantly, quicker decisions because they'd been there before in VR. And so that's the kind of thing I want to use VR for epic wins. And active shooter training is an epic win. I mean, it just works for the medium. I don't want to get all downer on talking about active shooters, but that's an example of the type of things. There's so many epic wins that you can begin to focus on. Trying to use VR for emailing together is it's just a silly use of a powerful medium. Yeah.
So, kind of going off from the active shooter XR experience and then the 1,000 cuts, do you have any best practices for dealing with these difficult experiences so you avoid like PTSD or replicating any emotional side effects?
Yeah, so thank you for that question. So 1,000 Cut Journey, for those that haven't tried it, is a 12-minute simulation where you become Michael Sterling, a black male, and you experience racial discrimination as an elementary school kid. There's kids throwing blocks and the teacher yells at you, even though you weren't the one that threw the block, and your classmates say some things that are pretty intense. As a teenager, where you go through a stop and frisk situation, where the police make you get on your knees, and pretty intense simulation. And then as an adult, you're in an interview scene, and you go to the interview, and the interviewer doesn't even see you. You're not there. Just doesn't acknowledge you. Can't believe that you're the applicant from Yale. To answer your question, 1,000 Cut Journey was built with a team of about 30 people, many of whom their primary area of research was studying race and health. And so it began from minute one working with domain experts who, this was what they do all day long. So number one, answer your question is you work with the absolute experts in the domain area. Number two is you move slowly. So 1,000 Cut Journey, which we're about to release on standalone VR for free, we're literally weeks away from making that thing work from PC VR onto the standalone. We're going to give it away free on all the different platforms. It's been around now for 6 years in various formats, and we have tested it everywhere. We've tested it in large-scale longitudinal studies. So Courtney Codburn, the genius behind it, she convinced Columbia University to make it required viewing for every incoming graduate student and studied it longitudinally. We looked at all sorts of outcome variables, including triggering and other negative outcomes. We've embedded this in lots of organizations, local governments, companies, et cetera, looked at it over time. So number two is you move slowly. Okay, and we've iterated based on feedback. Number three is you study it, and I mentioned the different types of studies that we've done. Number four is you have to have an onboarding and an offboarding aspect of it. So one of the mistakes I've made in my career is I wasn't careful with my language about VR and empathy early on, and we're going to build these simulations, and you do them, and it's going to change how you think about things. And the answer is VR is a very powerful medium. It does cause changes in attitudes and behavior, but it's not meant to be alone in a vacuum. And so with 1,000 Cut Journey, we don't just let you do it. We provide an onboarding and an offboarding curriculum with people to help you offboard. So the question about PTSD is an important one, and ultimately we work with the team to decide what are the pros and cons, the costs and benefits of allowing a simulation like this to exist at scale. And you just, the answer is you think a lot about it and you work with experts on it. So I love the question, and there's no magic answer other than time and expertise. Yeah.
Could you tell us a bit about how we can utilize technological synergies like combinations of XR, AI, and quantum computing and sensing, and maybe even blockchain, to both advance the software and hardware structures that make the tech, in addition to addressing legal, ethical, social, and policy aspects, and embed agreed upon values into the design to actively shape tech for good and for all?
Yeah, so thank you for that question. I'm going to focus on AI and VR because I think that's where I have the most answers. And when we think about combining AI and VR, my number one area, so I'm going to give you guys a joke. You guys can use it at cocktail parties if you'd like, okay? What are the 5 most important features to make a VR experience effective? That's the joke. That's the question. The answer is tracking, 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 and tracking. In other words, people think it's important to have good graphics or high field of view or even stereoscopic vision, which all those things are fun, but what makes VR important as a medium is that the scene responds to your body. The scene responds to your body. And so when in March 2020, when we all knew we were going to be in for a long haul remote, a lot of us in the VR field were surprised that VR didn't take off. Right? What better time for VR to win when people can't leave their homes? And so why hasn't that curve taken off? And the answer is, there's a few answers, but if I'm going to see your avatar and I'm going to spend hours with it, I need to have facial expressions. I need to have subtle shoulder movements that signal slumping attention. I need to have a waist that moves separately than my torso so I can see where you're leaning your body for attention, all these nonverbal cues that are so important. So when I think about the role of AI, one of my jobs over the past couple of years, I've worked with Hewlett-Packard, and we built something called the HP Reverb G2 Omnicept head-mounted display, okay? And what the Omnicept does is it uses various sensors in order to track what your face is doing and to track what your heart is doing. There's other things in there, but it's got lots of different types of sensors on the headset itself that can figure out heart rate variability, that can figure out if you're sweating or not, it can figure out the direction of your eyes, saccades, pupil dilation. It's got cameras that face down from the bottom that can do your face expression, and one of the goals of that is to be able to make your avatar do what your face is doing. When I worked with HP, there was a brilliant scholar, Erica Siegel, and Erica led a study, probably the largest VR study to date, 4 continents, thousands of people, where we took all those inputs, there's hundreds of them when you look at all the different degrees of freedom of each sensor, and we tried to build an algorithm for cognitive load. So as we said earlier, one of the main advantages of VR is for training. Training is the epic win from VR. It has been since 1929, the flight simulator. It remains the reason why most people use VR today, whether you're a Walmart employee or whether you're a person who buys a headset because you want to do Supernatural, the VR personal training app, which is the thing that moved more headsets than anything else. So training remains the home run. Knowing if someone has cognitive load is a really important thing in training. So there's something called the Goldilocks zone. If it's so boring, you don't want to engage. And if it's too challenging, you're overwhelmed. And so if you can define that Goldilocks zone, so Erica's work, and she's published a nice little paper on this, did incredible machine learning to assimilate all of these features you get from the eyes, the face, the heart, the skin, in order to build algorithms of predicting whether someone is going to be cognitive loaded now, but more importantly, cognitive loaded, in general or in the future. And so using AI in particular to understand what the body's doing, both so that you can change content, but just to make VR work, right? Why did Zoom win? Because I can see your face. Such as it is, we love Zoom because it works all the time, and it's free, so thank you, Zoom. But it's got its challenges, as we could talk about. But the reason it beat VR is because I know what your face is doing. Yeah, Britton.
Kind of a follow-up to that question. When I watched your keynote video, you talked about how there isn't a physical vocabulary yet in XR. And you also talked about the studies on synchronicity, which was how people kind of move in similar ways at similar times in experiences.
Yeah.
In your research, have you noticed any universal gestures coming out of people being involved in an immersive experience? And if so, what are those?
Yeah, so thank you, Britton. So we'll talk about 2 types of gestures. One we'll call the robust ones, the ones that work in the real world, and you can't change them in the VR world. And the other ones we'll call the emerging gestures. And so let me start with the second one. So Britton just did this, and if you use the HoloLens, that's one of the ones you've got to use in order to grab things. But in Engage, so for the 15 of you that we were just in Engage together, you all noticed that if you're going to mute yourself or unmute yourself, you rotate your wrist. In my classes, we now have 200,000 minutes of small groups in VR. It became a signal for turn taking, right? So when you saw somebody rotate your wrist, you know that they wanted to talk because you thought they were going to unmute themselves. And we have about 15 of these types of gestures that emerged. On the other hand, there are things that my colleague Byron Reeves and the late, great Cliff Nass would call mindlessness or automatic gestures. And so Mark Miller, raise your hand, Mark. Mark's on the academic job market this year, so I'll point that out. He's amazing and brilliant and awesome. He just published a paper in IEEE VR that showed the robustness of personal space, where people distance one another, and eye gaze, so when you're looking at something. So there's research from the 1950s on what's called the equilibrium theory. If you've ever got an elevator, you're forced to be very close to other people. You're actually forced to violate their personal space, but you have to because you're in an elevator. So what do? You don't look at them, right? You use one nonverbal cue, eye gaze, in order to buffer another one into personal space violations. And so there's a fairly robust psychological literature on the trade-off between looking at someone and spacing. And what Mark's research has shown is that this maintains itself at scale in VR. So when he looks at the trillions of data points that he has on many people over hours with 19 degrees of freedom every 90th of a second, you can build these models of how people are moving, and personal space is maintained. One of the funnest things, he and I were just talking about this, which is there's a finding in his research that no one's ever done in the psychological world because no one's had the data in order to support this, which is what we found out is that when you look at groups and you're looking at the variance of how people space themselves over time, who two people are pairwise, that maintains itself over time. In other words, in this room right now, based on where you're sitting, there's a nonverbal pattern that's emerging in this minute, and then 4 or 5 hours later, we can predict who you are simply based by how you are spaced pairwise with other people. It's not a 90% predictor, but it maintains. So Britton, there's a lot of automatic features that carry over, and then there's new ones that are emerging. Yeah. Yeah, Kent. Oops, sorry, someone else, yeah.
Yeah, one of the things that you had mentioned very briefly in your keynote was that you almost got like a little carve out from Meta to not have to have anonymous accounts. And now this is not something that I've ever heard of, or most education institutions don't have, that if you want to use MetaQuest, you have to have an account, a Meta account, where all this data is being tracked. And so I'm wondering if you can maybe talk a bit about how, if you foresee that maybe happening, or if this is a special research grant, or because essentially a lot of the MetaQuest pros are not, or MetaQuest is not necessarily FERPA compliant based upon their existing policies, and so how you see that kind of playing out.
Yeah, thanks, Kent, and thanks for your work in general on privacy. I'm glad you're here talking about it. So Facebook or Meta owns the right to everything the cameras in your headset sees, okay? So that's a complicated thing, and there's going to be a lot of discussion on that today, so I'm not going to trample the future talks on that. It was important to me, for my students, that they were able to at least dissociate that recorded data from their social media accounts and their real names. And so, as Ken pointed out, when I was planning this VR class in March 2020, it didn't go online until June 2021. We spent 15 months, the amount of legal work we had to do simply within Stanford to allow the entire course period be recorded for us to analyze data. We had to have third parties come in and be in charge of all sorts of things. We had to go through multiple layers of legal. It took 15 months to do. And I would say, not every minute of every day, but there was about a 2 or 3 month period with many, many meetings where I was just politely asking our dear friends at Meta, can you give me a way to not have my students' data recorded, and they were really receptive to it. They wanted to work with me on that, and I don't know why Kent or how, or I have no advice for anyone else. I just asked nicely and persistently, and they said yes. The workaround they came to was they would allow us to make fake emails and fake Facebook accounts that they would agree not to scrape. And so we did that, but here's the punchline here, which is so depressing. So many, many hours and a lot of political capital spent, and a lot of people just really, the people in the roles at Meta that went out of the way to do this, they had to spend political capital internally to make this happen too. And then the first day of class, we gave this amazing lecture, about the pros and cons of using your own account and privacy and all the things that it would predict, which you'll learn about later on. And one of the students raised their hand and they said, well, what's the advantage of using our Facebook account? And I hadn't heard that question before, and kind of on the fly I answered. I said, well, I guess if you, buy something or some asset, it'll stay with you for later on. And that was that, and we spent the next 55 minutes talking about the downsides of privacy, which we'll talk about later on. And then when we tallied the final votes, 95% of our students chose to use their own Facebook accounts, even though we'd gotten all the capital for them to use fake ones. So it was an interesting moment and a lot learned there. And they were really informed and had thought about it a lot. Yeah, Liz. I see you, Justin. I see you.
So you talk about how VR is great for training, and I fully agree. It's the killer app. The thing that I worry about is that the evil twin of training is persuasion, indoctrination, manipulation, deception. Have studies been done? Have you done studies that actually look at the dark side of the VR's capabilities?
Yeah. We've done a fair amount of work on persuasion and influence in particular. And so in VR, I can do things like if I were trying to persuade this whole crowd that VR was great and we were in social VR, what I could do is, because the way social VR works is that I'm sending out my tracking data individually to each of your headsets and you're drawing me locally. The lab for 25 years has worked on something called transformed social interaction. So because my headset is sending you tracking data, we can do really weird things. So I can, in order for VR to work right now, every single person is beaming their tracking data, their body movements, to everyone else simultaneously. We're all rendering each other 90 times a second on the fly, doing what the headsets told each other. Now, what I can do in VR as a teacher, or as an influencer, let's make it negative, I can receive the packet that has all of your tracking data, hold on to it for 2 or 3 seconds, and send each of you back your own tracking data with my name on it, so that what each of you is seeing is not my actual movements, but I'm mimicking all of you. And so we've done a lot of work on using this tracking data. So everyone basically, we all like being mimicked, and in the real world I can pick one of you and I can kind of mimic your gestures. And if there's been a lot of research on psychology, hundreds of studies that show when I mimic you non-verbally, you don't notice it, but you like me better, you're more likely to hire me, things of that nature. In VR it can be automatized and it can be done simultaneously at scale. So there, if you're interested in that, send me an email. I'll send you some work on transformed social interaction. In terms of what you're really asking about, which is propaganda and misinformation, et cetera. We are about to submit a paper. I'm working with Jeff Hancock and a graduate student named James Gardner, and we're writing a piece that summarizes what the world knows on misinformation and propaganda in VR, which is actually very little, and then really looking at, I like to say there is no VR. There's a lot of affordances that make a VR experience, but you can take the Microsoft Kinect, which tracks your body. Is that VR? Kinda. You can watch a stereoscopic IMAX movie. Is that VR? Kinda. And so we're looking at every single affordance, breaking it down, and then asking the question, well, what does mono versus stereo vision buy you when somebody's trying to sell you misinformation? And what does resolution matter? And what does body tracking matter? And so we're working on this, and I can say with great confidence that there's absolutely nothing done of substance in here. And what I'm trying to avoid, I'm very careful with trying not to be hyperbolic on, in my early days I was a bit hyperbolic sometimes. And so we're trying not to look at VR, we're really trying to look at the little affordances that make it. But it's something to worry about, absolutely, and there's been nothing done on it. Yep. Oh, hey, Eric. Good to see you.
Yeah, good to see you too.
Yeah.
I was wondering if maybe you could speak more specifically to issues in augmented reality as opposed to virtual reality, right? It seems like, for example, right, you're much less likely to step on your cat in augmented reality than in virtual reality, right? Or to have the kind of, or maybe actually you can correct me, maybe the dissociation, derealization issues are going to be at least different. So in terms of thinking about AR as opposed to VR, what sorts of concerns or applications are you interested in or excited about there?
Yeah, so for those that don't know what AR is, you're seeing the real world. You've got some type of glasses on. There's a layer projected on the real world such that in this room we would beam in an object and that would only be virtual. So I've been working on AR since 1999. Back then you had to use pass-through VR in order to do it, and have been paying close attention. We've done a lot of work on what happens when you bring people into the room via AR, and I'm just not excited about AR because the hardware, no offense to the brilliant folks at Microsoft and the brilliant folks at Magic Leap and what may be coming from Meta and other companies, I've just never seen a demo that meets the promise of the narrative. And for the types of demos, and this is going to sound a bit harsh, but whenever someone tells me about an AR demo, for example, using AR to fix a big machine on an oil rig, I say I love that as a pilot, but one thing I've done as a pilot project, but one thing I've done with VR is we've gone from using VR to train a handful of football players on teams to literally training, if you walk into any Bank of America or any Walmart right now, in the back room there's going to be 3 or 4 training systems in every single one in the United States. And working at that scale is really important if you're going to talk about something as a thing, right? And with AR, whenever I see someone give a talk about, fixing that machine on the oil rig, okay, how many people, if we stop time right now, are there 3 people doing that, 100 people, or 10,000, right? And the answer is typically 0 if you stop time, and how many are using it right now. And so I'm hopeful that with the pass-through from the MetaPass Pro and whatever Apple's going to make, that maybe with the pass-through video we'll see some innovation. And Mark Miller loves AR and studies it, and my amazing student Cyan DeVoe is building stuff in it. But I'm just kind of, I went through a really excited time in AR, but I'm just kind of bored with it because it just doesn't really work well. No offense to the people that make it, it's just a hard problem. Whereas VR, VR works pretty well. They want to wrap it up. Justin will close on you, and then I'm done. Yep. Ooh, I'm gonna be like. Yep.
So you mentioned in the tour that you've had members of Congress, their staff who've come through the lab. I'm curious, maybe not necessarily revealing the nature of those specific conversations, but other policymakers that perhaps have come through. What have been their interests, their curiosities? What have been some things that have stood out to you about, their interest in this technology?
Yeah, thank you, Justin. Before the Trump administration, we were working pretty closely with a number of branches on thinking about VR as a policy, as a medium that they had to think about. Those conversations halted a lot during the Trump years for just reasons that they had a different focus. At Stanford, we've had a lot of Congress people come through, and what's changed now compared to years ago is that most people, they've got family members that got a headset for Christmas, they know what the medium is, and so they certainly see the relevance of it, but I will say that my role when we work with these people is always explaining the technology to them as opposed to thinking about any in-depth questions. I mean, we're all still struggling to figure out Twitter and other things. I will say one of my hopes is we have a Stanford alumni, or a Stanford professor who's a Supreme Court Justice, Justice Cuellar, and he's thinking a lot of California tends to kind of move out towards the world, and he's thinking really deeply about this. So I'm excited about Justice Cuellar's thinking on it. Yeah. Okay, I'm sorry, one more, because this first woman is asking a question.
Thank you. I will try to make it really quick. I was thinking about that there is a lot of narratives about the immersion, how you enter the experience. And for me, the question is interesting, how do you exit from the experience? Thinking about a metaphor as diverse anti-compression chambers connected with misinformation. And also a really good point that you made about the commercialization and the standardization is that with that it comes a lot of assumptions on who are the users, and particularly in gender. And if you're going to use it for training, this is going to impact differently in women because we are not the main aim of these devices.
Yeah, just to put an exclamation point on that, so there's something called the interpupillary distance. That's the distance between your 2 pupils. The average IPD of a woman, the average, tends to be lower than the minimum IPD of most headsets. Just digest that for a second. The average distance of a woman's eyes is lower than the bottom IPD that the headsets let you go to. So that's a bummer. And so I'll leave you with that. So fix that, please. And but I could give you 40 examples of that. We do a lot of research on what we're calling them. We're calling them deltas, areas where VR can't represent people properly, and there's a lot of them. So it's an important area of focus, and I can send me an email, and I can point you to readings on that. Sorry to be extra here.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.